The courtroom was hushed, but the tension was electric. Judge Debra Livingston leaned forward, her voice sharp and precise, laced with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding the room. With a smirk that carried both arrogance and certainty, she asked a kind of question designed not to reveal truth, but to trap it. A loaded question crafted two-box Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett into a corner, to make her stumble before she even had the chance to breathe. "You say you stand for justice, Ms. Crockett," Livingston pressed, her tone cutting like glass. "But tell me, what right do you have to lecture this court on values you yourself haven't upheld?" The words landed like a slap, and for a split second, the silence grew heavier. Faces turned toward Crockett, waiting for a crack in her composure, waiting for a flicker of doubt. This was supposed to be the judge's moment, the apex of her control, the kind of verbal strike that could silence anyone. But Jasmine Crockett was not anyone. She sat there, still as stone, yet alive with fire, her eyes fixed on Livingston with an unflinching steadiness that unsettled even the most jaded spectators. The courtroom leaned in, sensing something about to break a storm, ready to release its fury. Then, without raising her voice, without a hint of hesitation, Crockett delivered her answer with razor-sharp clarity. "Judge Livingston, the only values I've ever stood for are justice and dignity. And if defending those values offends you, maybe you should ask yourself why." Qua. The line sliced through the room. Audible gasps echoed. Someone shifted nervously in their seat. Even those who had come expecting Crockett to falter were suddenly captivated, unable to look away. It wasn't just a response, it was a declaration, a challenge, a refusal to be diminished. Livingston blinked, the flicker of surprise impossible to hide. The power dynamic shifted instantly, and the air carried the weight of a moment people knew they would replay in their minds long after they left this room. But Crockett wasn't finished. She hadn't just parried an attack. She had turned the blade back toward the hand that wielded it, and as the crowd braced for her next move, one truth became inescapable. This battle had only just begun, because what happened seconds later made even the judge regret speaking those words. This wasn't just another courtroom sparring match. The walls of that chamber seemed to carry more than the echoes of legal arguments. They held the weight of a nation's gaze. Cameras outside buzzed with reporters, desperate for a headline. Commentators whispered about the significance of this hearing, and ordinary citizens, tuned in from their homes, felt in their bones that what they were witnessing was more than a clash between a judge and a congresswoman. It was a mirror of America itself. Judge Debra Livingston wasn't merely a figure in a robe, she represented the system, the centuries of entrenched authority, and the arrogance of those who believed power was theirs by default. Her questions weren't just legal maneuvers. They carried the sting of a history where voices like Jasmine Crockett's were expected to remain silent. And Crockett, she embodied something far greater than one person on one stage. She was the product of resilience, of communities long underestimated, people who had been told to wait their turn for far too long. Every word she spoke in that chamber carried the pulse of generations who refused to be erased. To some in the room, she was just a lawmaker under pressure. But to countless others watching, she was proof that dignity, intelligence, courage could rise even under the fiercest scrutiny. The stakes weren't theoretical, they were immediate. Every pause, every syllable, every flicker of expression had the power to ripple far beyond that courtroom. A stumble could mean ammunition for critics eager to discredit her. A triumph could inspire millions to believe that truth and justice still had champions in a system often bent toward corruption and exclusion. Whispers floated through the courtroom gallery. One spectator leaned to another. "She's holding her ground." On social media, hashtags began brewing, anticipation rising like a tide. Hashtag Crockett vs. Livingston. Hashtag Truth on Trial. The nation wasn't just observing. It was choosing sides, waiting to see who would claim the upper hand In this escalating duel, what made it all the more riveting was the imbalance of power on display. Here was a federal judge, cloaked in authority, with the gavel, the bench, and the law on her side door, so it seemed. Across from her sat a congresswoman, armed only with her mind, her conviction, and her unshakable belief that truth could cut deeper than tradition. It was David and Goliath, but rewritten for the modern age. And for once, Goliath looked uneasy because Crockett wasn't simply defending herself. She was defending the right of every underrepresented voice to speak without fear, to challenge power without being crushed. She was defending the principle that integrity doesn't bow, even when the entire system tries to force it down. This was no longer just about a pointed question or a clever response. It was about whether arrogance could still silence courage in 2025 America. It was about whether dignity could prevail in a world increasingly numbed by scandal and corruption. And just when Livingston thought she had control, the atmosphere shifted. Judge Debra Livingston's presence in the courtroom was undeniable. She was a figure who carried herself with a sharpness honed by decades in the legal world. Her voice, clipped and precise, cut through the air with the authority of someone used to being obeyed without hesitation. To many, she was the very embodiment of the establishment's stern, unwavering, unyielding. But beneath that polished veneer of judicial impartiality lay a persona shaped by contradictions and controversies that revealed far more than she might have intended. Livingston had built her career on the image of intellectual rigor. She was often praised for her encyclopedic knowledge of the law, her ability to cite precedent with lightning speed, and her strict adherence to courtroom procedure. Admirers described her as no-nonsense, disciplined, incapable of being swayed by theatrics. But critics, and there were many, painted a different picture. To them, she was cold, dismissive, and intolerant of challenges, especially when they came from voices that didn't fit the mold of power she respected. Her rulings over the years had not been without controversy. Civil rights attorneys recalled moments when her judgments leaned more toward preserving institutional authority than protecting vulnerable individuals. In immigration cases, she had developed a reputation for a hard line, often favoring procedural rigidity over the human stories unfolding before her. "The law is the law," she would say, as though justice itself were secondary to the structure that held it. To some, it sounded like fairness. To others, it rang as indifference, cloaked in formality. Observers noted how her interactions in the courtroom often betrayed an unspoken hierarchy. With colleagues or established legal giants, her tone softened, even deferential at times. But with those she deemed inexperienced, unworthy, or too bold, she wielded her authority like a blade. Interruptions came swiftly, often dripping with condescension. Questions weren't asked to probe, but to corner, to expose, to remind the other person of their place. That was Livingston's courtroom philosophy: control through intimidation. She believed the bench was not just a platform for justice, but a stage for her dominance, and it was effective. Many who stood before her found themselves shrinking, stumbling over their words, careful not to spark her impatience. She had a way of looking down, not just literally from the elevated bench, but with a gaze that could reduce even seasoned attorneys to nervous wrecks. It wasn't simply her rulings that drew criticism. It was her manner. Stories circulated of her dismissing community advocates with a wave of her hand, or offering a sharp smile when silencing those who dared to challenge her authority. To her supporters, it was efficiency. She kept order, prevented grandstanding, and ensured the law moved forward without delay. To her detractors, it was arrogance and inability, or unwillingness, to see the human lives affected by the machinery of the system she so zealously protected. Livingston, in many ways, was the perfect symbol of entrenched authority: intelligent yet unapproachable, disciplined yet unyielding, powerful yet blind to the humanity beneath her gavel. She carried herself as though the system itself spoke through her, as if the institution were not to be questioned but obeyed. But therein lay the contradiction. For someone so deeply invested in the letter of the law, she often seemed dismissive of the spirit of justice. She could recite precedents like scripture, yet appeared unmoved by the inequities those precedents perpetuated. She championed rules, but only when they served the preservation of order. And when confronted by those who sought to bend the law toward fairness, she responded not with curiosity, but with disdain. It was no surprise then that Livingston's attempt to corner Jasmine Crockett carried the same hallmarks: a loaded question, dripping with the assumption that Crockett would falter, that she would crumble under the weight of judicial authority. In Livingston's world, challenges ended not with dialogue, but with humiliation. She sought not truth, but submission, and that was precisely why this confrontation mattered so much. Livingston wasn't just a judge with a question. She was a representative of something far larger, the entrenched belief that authority is always right, that dignity can be dismissed, that voices from the margins should know their place. Her arrogance wasn't personal, it was systemic. Every sharp question she threw, every dismissive glance, every cold ruling in her past was part of a broader narrative, the story of power's refusal to acknowledge its flaws. And yet, for all her authority, Livingston had never faced someone quite like Jasmine Crockett. She had sparred with attorneys, silenced advocates, and brushed aside critics. But now, she was up against a voice that refused to shrink, a voice that carried not only intellect and sharpness, but also the fire of lived experience, the weight of communities that had been silenced too long, and the unshakable belief that justice belonged to everyone, not just a powerful dot in that courtroom. Livingston wasn't facing a mere congresswoman. She wasn't even facing a single opponent across the aisle. She was facing the embodiment of a new era, one that challenged every assumption. She cared about who deserved to speak and who deserved to be silenced. But Crockett wasn't facing a judge. She was facing an idea that needed dismantling. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in the marble halls of power or in the oak-paneled courtrooms where her words now command attention. It began in neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce, where injustice wasn't a distant theory, but a daily reality. She grew up watching how systems could crush the voiceless, how power too often protected the privileged, and how the law could be wielded as both a weapon and a shield. Those early lessons became the bedrock of her determination. If the law could silence, it could also defend, and she was going to make it defend those who needed it most. Her path was anything but easy. Education became her first battleground. While others were handed the benefits of legacy and wealth, Jasmine had to claw for every inch of progress. She studied late into the night, working jobs to pay tuition, all while carrying the weight of knowing that her success wasn't just her own. It was a chance to open doors for others who had been told they didn't belong. Law school wasn't glamorous. It was grueling, but it was there. It's that her resilience crystallized into something stronger, a conviction that knowledge could be a weapon against injustice. As a young lawyer, she didn't chase the high-paying corporate firms. She chose the hard cases, the ones others shied away from, defending clients who couldn't afford a defense, standing beside immigrants facing deportation, representing families broken apart by systemic failures. These were the battles she took on, not for glory, but for principle. Courtrooms became arenas where she was underestimated time and again. Judges rolled their eyes. Opposing counsel smirked. Whispers suggested she was out of her depth. Yet, case by case, argument by argument, she proved them wrong. Her sharp legal mind, fused with lived empathy, made her a force no one could easily dismiss. What set Jasmine apart wasn't just her skill, it was her fire. She didn't view the law as a sterile set of rules. She saw it as a living, breathing force that should serve the people. When she stood before a bench, she wasn't just advocating for a client. She was carrying entire communities on her shoulders, and people noticed. Community activists began to see her as their champion, someone who could translate frustration into action, someone who refused to accept "that's just how the system works" as an answer. Her rise into politics was almost inevitable. The same courage that fueled her in the courtroom began to ignite in the public sphere. She spoke with a clarity and boldness that cut through political doublespeak. She wasn't afraid to name injustice for what it was, nor was she willing to dilute her convictions to appease the powerful. Critics labeled her too fiery, too aggressive, or too outspoken. But to those who had long been silenced, her voice was oxygen. She was unapologetically herself, unwilling to be polished into palatability. That authenticity drew people in it, made her dangerous to the establishment and beloved by those on the margins. Crockett's political style was forged in the crucible of these struggles. She was never content to play by rules designed to exclude. Instead, she challenged those very rules, demanding they bend toward justice. She embodied the resilience of those who had been told to wait their turn, the determination of those who refused to be erased. Every speech she gave, every case she fought, every stand she took carried a message. Dignity is not negotiable, and justice cannot be delayed. Her opponents often tried to paint her as reckless or radical, but what they failed to understand was that Jasmine's so-called radicalism was simply honesty, the kind of honesty that made the comfortable squirm. She wasn't reckless. She was relentless. She wasn't radical. She was real. She carried the frustration of generations, but fused it with hope, transforming pain into power. By the time she entered that fateful courtroom exchange with Judge Debra Livingston, Jasmine Crockett was no stranger to confrontation. She had stared down dismissive judges before. She had faced opponents who underestimated her intellect. She had endured the coded insults, the subtle condescension, the overt attempts to put her in her place. And every single time, she had walked away sharper, tougher, more unshakable. What made her dangerous to Livingston wasn't just her knowledge of the lot, was her knowledge of people. She understood how power worked, how arrogance could blind those who wielded it, how authority often relied on intimidation rather than truth. She had seen it too many times to be rattled by it. In Livingston's loaded question, Jasmine recognized the tactic immediately. She knew what was happening, the attempt to trap, to corner, to reduce her to silence. But Crockett also knew something Livingston didn't, that silence was never an option for her. Not now, not ever. Her journey had given her armor thicker than Livingston could imagine. Every insult, every attempt to discredit her, every barrier she had overcome was now part of her weaponry. She was more than prepared. She was destined for this. And so, when Livingston tried to corner her, Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. She stood, as she always had, calm, steady, yet ready to strike with precision. The courtroom may have expected hesitation, but what they saw instead was the culmination of a lifetime of battles fought. In one dot, and it was these very battles that prepared her for the moment of truth against Livingston. The opening salvo had landed, but Judge Debra Livingston wasn't finished. If anything, her failed attempt to corner Jasmine Crockett seemed only to sharpen her determination. Her voice grew sharper, her tone more dismissive, her interruptions timed with surgical precision. She leaned forward as if authority itself could overwhelm Crockett into submission, layering her words with barbed insinuations. Each sentence was a calculated strike designed to make Crockett stumble, to break her composure in front of the watching crowd. "You still haven't addressed the core issue, Congresswoman," Livingston said with an edge. "You're speaking in abstractions. Do you even understand the implications of what you're suggesting?" The words dripped with condescension, and the audience bristled. It wasn't a question meant for clarity. It was a public attempt at humiliation. Crockett, however, did not flinch. Her eyes stayed locked on the judge.com and steady, refusing to yield even an ounce of dignity. Instead of rushing to respond, she let Livingston's interruptions hang in the air, exposing the arrogance in every word. The silence that followed each jab wasn't weakness, it was restraint. And that restraint was more powerful than any retort. The longer Crockett waited, the more obvious it became. Livingston was unraveling. Not her. The interruptions grew more frequent. Each time Crockett began to build a point, Livingston cut across, raising her voice ever so slightly, trying to dominate the rhythm of the exchange. But in her eagerness to overpower, Livingston revealed something more damning her impatience. She was no longer the poised figure of authority, but a judge pressing too hard, trying desperately to assert control. The audience could sense it. Murmurs rippled across the room, people shifting in their seats, eyes darting between the judge's stern face and Crockett's unshaken calm. The dynamic had begun to invert. Livingston, cloaked in her robe of authority, looked smaller with each forced interruption. Crockett, with nothing but her voice and composure, looked larger with every pause she commanded. Then came the sharpest accusation yet. "This is grandstanding," Livingston sneered. "You're not here to argue, lawyer, here to perform." The statement was meant to discredit, to reduce Crockett to a caricature. But in the very act of accusing her of performance, Livingston herself had slipped into theater. Her words laced with emotion rather than reason. Crockett inhaled slowly, her demeanor unshaken. The audience leaned in. They could feel something brewing. It was as though Crockett had been waiting, letting the storm pass, allowing Livingston to expose the depths of her arrogance before choosing her moment. She wasn't retreating. She was calculating. Livingston pressed again, her voice almost trembling with impatience. "Answer the question directly unless, of course, you can't." Gasps flickered through the room. It was the line of a cornered adversary, not a commanding judge. The imbalance of power had shifted almost invisibly and yet unmistakably in Crockett's favor. Still, Crockett said nothing. Her silence was not surrender, but suspense, a silence that demanded attention. Every second stretched longer, and the audience could practically feel the weight of the unspoken. The arrogance of authority had met the patience of resilience, and it was the latter that now held the room captive. By now, Livingston's attempts to corner her had turned into overreach. The judge's words no longer sounded incisive, but insecure. The once commanding tone had become frantic, almost pleading for control. Crockett had allowed her opponent to sink deeper into the pit she had dug herself. The tension was unbearable. Every eye in the room was locked on Crockett, waiting. They knew she hadn't spoken her full piece yet. They knew the silence was just the calm before the strike. And as Livingston delivered one final dismissive jab, the audience could feel that the balance of power was about to tilt in dramatic fashion. But Crockett had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. The chamber had fallen into a taut silence, as if the very air was holding its breath. Judge Debra Livingston's last jab, sharp, dismissive, dripping with superiorities, till hung in the room like smoke after a gunshot. She leaned back in her chair, confident she had landed a blow that Crockett could not recover from. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She let the silence linger, let it build until it became almost unbearable. Until the entire chamber leaned forward unconsciously, waiting for what she would do next. Then, with a calm that seemed unshakable, she spoke. "Judge Livingston," Crockett began, tone low but commanding, each syllable precise. "You've mistaken my composure for weakness, and you've mistaken your robe for unquestionable authority. But let's set the record straight." Gasps rippled through the audience. The bluntness of her opening line sent a shock through the room. No one spoke to a federal judge like that, at least not without trembling. But Crockett wasn't trembling. Her voice carried both restraint and razor-sharp precision. She continued, her words steady, each one a carefully aimed strike. "You ask if I understand the implications of what I'm saying. Let me remind you I understand them because I've lived them. I didn't inherit privilege. I didn't grow up with the luxury of being detached from the struggles that ordinary people face. I earned every step of this journey, and I know what injustice looks like, because it has touched me, my family, and my community directly." The audience erupted in quiet murmurs, their reactions impossible to contain. Livingston shifted slightly in her chair, her expression stiffening. Crockett paused deliberately, letting the moment sink in before delivering the next blow. "You sit there, cloaked in the authority of your position, believing that power comes from title and tradition. But real power, true authority, comes from understanding the people you claim to serve. And on that count, Judge, you're bankrupt." The murmurs rose louder. A few gasps. The sense of something historic happening filled the chamber. Crockett was dismantling not just Livingston's question, but the entire aura of arrogance that had clung to her. Livingston tried to interject, her lips parting as though to reclaim control. But Crockett raised her hand ever so slightly, not in arrogance, but in command. And astonishingly, the judge froze. The silence returned, and Crockett seized it again. "You say I'm performing?" She pressed on. "Well, let's talk about performance. Because what is more performative than pretending impartiality while delivering decisions that crush working families? What is more theatrical than dismissing the lived realities of marginalized communities, as though justice is some abstract concept rather than a daily necessity? You call me a performer, but what you're really upset about is that my performance is exposing your hypocrisy." Gasps echoed through the chamber. A spectator audibly whispered, "Oh my God," and heads turned in every direction as Crockett's words landed like thunder. Livingston's face tightened. Her once confident demeanor now betrayed the smallest cracks, a twitch of the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes, a flush creeping into her cheeks. She adjusted her papers, her fingers fumbling slightly, betraying nerves. Crockett didn't let up. She leaned forward, her voice intensifying just enough to carry without rising in volume. "You interrupt me because you fear the truth of what I'm saying. You dismiss me because you fear the strength of where I come from. And you try to corner me because you cannot imagine that someone like me, a black woman from Texas, raised without privilege, could stand here and speak with more authority than you." The chamber erupted. Applause burst from one corner, quickly hushed by attendants, but the energy couldn't be contained. People were sitting on the edge of their seats, eyes wide, mouths open. Crockett held the silence once more, then delivered the final turn of the knife. "But here's the reality. I don't need your robe to validate me. I don't need your title to justify my presence. And I certainly don't need your approval to stand up for the truth. Because I'm not standing here for myself. I'm standing here for the countless people who've been silenced, dismissed, and cornered by authority figures just like you. And I will not let them be silenced any longer." The words landed like a hammer. Livingston visibly recoiled, her composure cracking. She tried to collect herself, but the room no longer belonged to her. All eyes, all energy, all gravity had shifted to Crockett. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was electric. The chamber felt transformed, the atmosphere thick with the weight of history being written in real time. Crockett's rebuttal wasn't just a counterattack. It was a dismantling, a demolition of arrogance, brick by brick, until nothing remained but raw truth. Livingston looked down, shuffling papers with trembling hands, her attempts at regaining authority faltering with every movement. The confidence that once defined her posture had evaporated, replaced by an uneasy stiffness. Crockett sat back, once again, as though she had merely spoken fact, not delivered a takedown that would echo beyond those walls. She didn't need to gloat. She didn't need to raise her voice. The power of her words lingered, echoing in the minds of everyone present. And then, in one final devastating line, she sealed the moment. "You tried to corner me, Judge, but all you've done is corner yourself, revealing exactly why voices like mine will never stop rising." The chamber erupted not with chaos, but with the unmistakable energy of triumph. Gasps, whispers, Even stifled applause vibrated against the marble walls. Livingston's face betrayed the truth. She knew she had lost this round. The robe no longer protected her. Authority no longer shielded her. And Crockett had walked away not just unscathed, but victorious. The silence that followed carried more weight than 1,000 rulings. It was the silence of an establishment figure, dethroned not by spectacle, but by truth. And as the words echoed across the room, the ripple effects were only just beginning. The moment Jasmine Crockett's words left her lips, it was as though they detonated across the country in real time. The chamber's marble walls could only contain so much. The rest spilled outward, carried by cameras, phones, and restless fingers ready to hit share. Within minutes, the clip of her mic drop rebuttal hit social media. By the time she walked out of the courthouse doors, the digital wildfire was already raging. Hashtags shot to the top of trending lists. Hashtag Crockett clapback. Hashtag Livingston regrets. Hashtag truth in court. On TikTok, the clip was looped endlessly with captions like she ate and left no crumbs, and when the student schools the judge. Twitter pulsed with disbelief and delight. Users piling in with memes of Livingston's tightening jaw, juxtaposed with Crockett's poised delivery. The internet had its verdict, and it was unanimous. Crockett had not just survived, she had triumphed. Instagram Reels slowed her line. You've mistaken your robe for unquestionable authority and set it to dramatic music. On YouTube, reaction channels dissected every pause, every eyebrow raise, every tremor in Livingston's hand. Commentators who usually argued bitterly across the aisle seemed, for once, united. This was a political and cultural moment no one could ignore. Cable news picked it up that evening. Anchors played the clip in heavy rotation, their voices carrying tones of awe and astonishment. Progressive outlets hailed it as the courtroom takedown of the decade, while even some centrist pundits conceded that Livingston had overplayed her hand. Across the ticker ran words like viral showdown. Judge dismantled Crockett's courage. Perhaps the most telling response came not from pundits, but from ordinary Americans. Working mothers in kitchens texted clips to their friends. Finally, someone spoke truth to them. College students stitched TikToks, their captions flashing, "THIS is why representation matters." Older voters on Facebook reshared the video with comments like, "Reminds me why I still believe in fighters." The memes kept rolling in, images of Crockett wielding a mic like a sword. Livingston edited into titanic scenes, sinking beneath the waves of Crockett's words. Captions like, "Judge, you may sit down now." Each one sharpened the cultural edge, etching the moment deeper into public consciousness. Meanwhile, conservative corners tried to spin it as disrespect, but the backlash to that framing was swift. Viral replies shredded the attempt. Disrespect? She showed more respect to truth than your judge did to justice. Every attempt to diminish her only amplified the reach of the original clip. What made it powerful wasn't just Crockett's command of the facts, it was the symbolism. To millions, she represented every voice that had been belittled, interrupted, dismissed, or told to wait their turn. She was the sharp retort to centuries of arrogance cloaked in authority. She had made visible, in one exchange, the imbalance of power and then flipped it on its head by the end of the week. Her words had been quoted in op-eds, printed on protest signs, and even spray-painted on walls in activist hubs. Real power comes from understanding the people you claim to serve became more than a line. It became a rallying cry. In living rooms, on campuses, in barbershops and cafes, people replayed the clip, not just for entertainment, but for reassurance, for inspiration. It was validation that courage and clarity could puncture the thick armor of the establishment. And for Judge Livingston, silence. No public comment, no statement, no attempt at damage control. Her stillness became its own story, proof that Crockett's words had cut deeper than anyone could measure. The absence of rebuttal was louder than any denial. As the days passed, Crockett's name became synonymous with defiance and triumph. She wasn't just a politician anymore. She was a symbol, a reminder that the fight for justice wasn't abstract, it was personal, immediate, lived in moments where dignity clashed with arrogance. And yet, beyond the hashtags, the viral memes, the jubilant commentary, something else stirred. Beneath the celebration, a deeper current began to flow on understanding that this wasn't merely a performance, or even just a victory in a single courtroom exchange, because beyond the headlines lay a deeper lesson about dignity and power. When the clamor of the viral storm began to settle, what lingered was not just the sound of Crockett's voice, but the principle behind it. In reframing Livingston's attack, she had done more than win an argument. She had carved a truth into the public conscience. Dignity will always outlast arrogance. Crockett reminded the nation that the measure of strength is not in titles or robes, not in the hauteur of authority, but in the ability to meet condescension with clarity and contempt with calm conviction. Livingston came armed with a robe, precedent, and position. Crockett came armed with truth, resilience, and the unshakable belief that justice is bigger than any one judge. And in that clash, the lesson was undeniable. Arrogance may intimidate in the moment, but dignity reverberates across generations. Her words distilled something deeper about democracy itself. A system built on checks and balances, on power meant to serve people rather than humiliate them, cannot survive if arrogance rules unchallenged. Crockett's stand in that courtroom was not simply personal, it was national. She had embodied what millions quietly yearned for, someone willing to look abuse of authority in the eye and refuse to shrink. The brilliance of her response lay not only in its sharpness, but in its generosity. She didn't just dismantle Livingston. She offered the country a vision of leadership grounded in respect. Respect for communities too often silenced. Respect for the sacrifices of immigrants, workers, and dreamers. Respect for the everyday people whose dignity is the cornerstone of democracy. And for those watching, it was more than a clapback. It was validation. Validation that their frustrations were real, their dignity mattered, and their voice could find resonance through leaders like her. Crockett had transformed a courtroom skirmish into a universal call that no matter how entrenched arrogance may seem, it can still be undone by courage and conviction. The impact of that moment stretched far beyond partisan lines. It struck a chord across divides because the principle she invoked is universal. Every parent who's been talked down to by someone in power, every worker dismissed by a boss who never listened, every student who's had their intelligence questioned each could see a piece of themselves in Crockett's calm defiance. And so, her exchange with Livingston will not be remembered for the judge's question. It will be remembered for the answer that lit up the room and rippled outward. Dignity is not fragile. It is unbreakable. Authority rooted in arrogance may loom large, but when it collides with truth, crumbles. That's why, long after the hashtags fade and the news cycle turns, the moment will remain. Not just as a viral clip, but as a reminder, small yet powerful declaration of what democracy demands. Courage in the face of condescension. Justice in the face of manipulation. Dignity in the face of arrogance. And that's why this moment will be remembered long after the gavel fell. Judge Debra Livingston tried to corner Jasmine Crockett. For a fleeting second, she may have believed her authority would silence the Congresswoman. That arrogance could overpower conviction. But as the world witnessed, it was Livingston who walked away with regret, Crockett who stood taller than ever. The title of this story says it all. The attempt to trap her backfired. And what remained was a powerful lesson in courage and truth. This was never just about one exchange. It was about something bigger. The reminder that truth and dignity will always outshine arrogance, no matter how polished or powerful it may appear. Crockett's strength wasn't just in her words. It was in the calm, unshakable confidence she carried on behalf of every person who has ever been underestimated, dismissed, or talked down to. Moments like this don't just inspire, they define movements. They remind us why justice matters, why democracy must be defended, and why voices like Crockett's deserve amplification. And here's where you come in. If you felt the fire of that moment, if you believe dignity can defeat arrogance, if you want more stories where truth triumphs over abuse of power, then don't just watch. Be part of this movement. Hit that like button. Share this video so the message spreads further than Livingston ever imagined. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the moments that shake America and remind us who we are, because in the end, it's not about one courtroom or one clash. It's about all of us standing together, lifting our voices, and ensuring that justice, integrity, and dignity always have the final word. And with your support, they will.